They called it a clumsy giant, a fat bird that couldn't possibly dance in the sky. They laughed at its size, its sheer bulk, and in the quiet confidence of their cockpits, they dismissed it as a desperate, flawed machine. They were wrong. And that mistake would cost them the sky itself. This is the story of a revolution, not of politics or nations, but of steel, fire, and the indomitable will to adapt and overcome. For 2 long years, the Pacific was a kingdom ruled by a single, fearsome sovereign, the Mitsubishi A6M0. It was a masterpiece of design, an aircraft that seemed to float on the wind. To achieve its legendary agility and incredible range, its designers had stripped it of everything they deemed non-essential. There was no armor to protect the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks to prevent a catastrophic fire, often not even a radio to coordinate an attack. The Zero was a duelist's weapon, a whisper of silk and steel designed for a single, graceful kill. Its pilots were the new samurai of the air, artists of the dogfight who had swept aside every opponent with breathtaking ease. Men like the celebrated ace, Captain Kenji Tanaka, looked upon the early American fighters and saw them as predictable and inferior. When the first reports of a new American carrier fighter, the Grumman F6F Hellcat, began to filter in, he and his comrades scoffed. It was bigger, heavier, and by their logic, destined to be a slow, unresponsive failure. It was, they believed, a gunfight where the opponent had brought a club. But the first encounters were not a duel. They were a brutal lesson in a new kind of warfare. Lieutenant Arata Sato, a veteran of 100 skirmishes, was one of the first to learn this lesson. Spotting a lone Hellcat below, he pushed his Zero into a dive, anticipating the familiar dancer-turning fight where his superior maneuverability would inevitably grant him the killing shot. But the Hellcat didn't turn. Instead, it did something that defied his understanding of aerial combat. The fat bird pointed its nose to the sky and climbed, not just matching his Zero, but outclimbing it with a terrifying raw power he had never witnessed. As he struggled to follow, the Hellcat simply rolled over and dove back down, its 6 heavy machine guns opening up a stream of fire that felt like a hailstorm of steel. Sato's fragile Zero, built for grace, not punishment, disintegrated around him. He was lucky to escape with his life. His experience was not unique. Ensign Kato Mori reported a similar shock. He had managed to get on a Hellcat's tail, pouring cannon fire into its fuselage. Any other aircraft would have been torn apart, but the American machine simply absorbed the punishment, trailing smoke but continuing to fly as if unconcerned. Then, its wingman, a second Hellcat that Mori hadn't even seen, dove from above, guided by a calm voice over the radio. The sky erupted in a torrent of 50 caliber rounds. The Americans weren't dueling. They were hunting in a pack. This was the dawn of a new philosophy, energy fighting. The Hellcat pilots were trained to refuse the Zero's invitation to a turning dogfight. They understood their machine was not a fencer's rapier, but a knight's warhammer. Their strategy was built on the brute force of their Pratt & Whitney engine. They would use its power to gain altitude, to maintain speed, and to execute devastating boom and zoom attacks. They would dive, strike with overwhelming firepower, and then use their momentum to climb back to the safety of high altitude, ready to strike again. They fought with patience, discipline, and technology. Their radios allowed them to coordinate with a precision the Japanese, fighting in near silence, could not comprehend. The technological gap was widening into a chasm. It wasn't just the Hellcat's armor, its firepower, or its ruggedness. The true game-changer was something the Japanese pilots couldn't even see: radar. American carriers had become floating fortresses, not just of guns, but of information. Their fighter direction systems could detect incoming Japanese formations from over 100 miles away. Hellcat squadrons were no longer just patrolling. Kata vectored with chilling accuracy to intercept points in the sky. For the Japanese pilots, it felt like flying into an invisible web, an ambush orchestrated by a ghost. They would arrive at their target, expecting to find surprise ships, only to be met by a wall of Hellcats descending from the sun, already in perfect position to attack. As the war dragged into 1944, this technological superiority was compounded by a catastrophic human crisis on the Japanese side. The empire was running out of everything: resources, fuel, and most critically, experienced pilots. The veteran aces who had conquered the Pacific were nearly all gone. Their replacements were young men, brave and willing, but tragically undertrained. A critical fuel shortage meant their training time was slashed to a mere 200 or 300 hours, barely enough to master the basics of flight, let alone the deadly art of combat. They were sent into battle against American pilots who had received extensive, high-quality training, flying a superior machine, and guided by a flawless system of command and control. The result was slaughter on an industrial scale. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, that would be forever known to American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, was the ultimate expression of the Hellcats' dominance. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft were launched in a desperate, all-out assault. They flew into a perfectly orchestrated meat grinder, guided by radar. Squadrons of Hellcats climbed to high altitude and waited. As the Japanese formations appeared, the Hellcats fell upon them like wolves on a flock of sheep. The sky was filled with fireballs and falling wreckage. The disciplined, energy-fighting tactics were unstoppable. One-sided dogfights ended in seconds. A few Japanese planes that broke through were met by a curtain of anti-aircraft fire from the fleet that was unlike anything ever seen before. By the end of the day, Japan had lost nearly 400 aircraft and the core of its remaining naval pilots. The Americans had lost less than 30. The psychological impact was devastating. Surviving Japanese pilots began to speak of Hellcat syndrome, a deep-seated dread, a feeling of utter helplessness against an invincible foe. They knew that to face a Hellcat in a Zero was to invite death. This profound sense of technological and tactical inferiority led to a dark and desperate conclusion. If they could not win in a conventional fight, they would have to change the very definition of the fight itself. The rise of the kamikaze, the divine wind, was the ultimate, tragic acknowledgement of the Hellcat's supremacy. It was an admission that the only way to destroy an American ship was to physically crash a plane into it, because there was no longer any hope of fighting through the shield of Hellcats that protected it. When the war finally ended, the full scope of the Hellcats' achievement became clear. The statistics were staggering, almost unbelievable. In just 2 years of combat, the F6F Hellcat had achieved a kill-to-loss ratio of 19-1. Its pilots were credited with destroying 5,223 enemy aircraft in exchange for only 270 Hellcats lost in aerial combat. It was the most successful naval fighter in history, a machine that had single-handedly broken the back of Japanese air power. Post-war analysis revealed the deep industrial truths behind this dominance. The Hellcat's R2800 engine was a marvel of mass production, with perfectly interchangeable parts. In contrast, Japanese engines were largely hand-fitted, making them difficult to maintain and impossible to produce at scale. In the 30 months it was in service, America's industrial might produced over 12,000 Hellcats. In all of 1944, Japan managed to produce just over 5,000 fighters of all types combined. The Hellcat was more than just a plane that won battles. It was a system that changed the very nature of war at sea. It transformed the aircraft carrier from a high-value, vulnerable target into the undisputed queen of the Oceano mobile airbase that could project overwhelming power thousands of miles from home. It was the platform that enabled the great island-hopping campaigns and carried the war to Japan's doorstep. Years later, the old ace, Captain Kenji Tanaka, reflected on the war he had survived. The early arrogance was gone, replaced by the quiet wisdom of a man who had seen a world change beneath his wings. He spoke of the Zero with a warrior's respect for a beautiful, sharp blade. But when asked about the Hellcat, his voice was filled with a different kind of awe of a man who has faced an elemental force of nature. "We were proud," he said. "We believed our skill and spirit were unmatched. We did not understand. In the end, we brought swords to a gunfight." The story of the Hellcat is a powerful reminder that victory is never born from a single quality. It is not just about the skill of the pilot, the agility of the machine, or the courage of the warrior. It is about the vision to see a new way of fighting. It is about the humility to learn from failure, the industrial power to build the tools of success, and the strategic discipline to wield them as one. It is the story of how a clumsy giant, underestimated and mocked, learned to dance a different dance of power, teamwork, and relentless innovation that cleared the skies and changed the world.